Arthur Dayne was born under the gleam of first light, or so the story went, as the sun's early rays illuminated the white stone of Starfall. His parents told him that Dawn, the ancestral sword of House Dayne, whispered to him when he was yet a babe in the cradle, as if the sword itself recognized him. Whether that was the truth or a fond fancy spun by doting kin, Arthur never knew. But his earliest memory, one he carried in the recesses of his mind like a half-remembered dream, was of the sword of the morning resting against a polished rack, the milk-white blade catching a ghostly shimmer from candlelight. Even as a child, he would stare at it and wonder if its pale glow was moonlight made metal, or if there was some living presence within that steel. He grew into a man whose fame spread across the 7 kingdoms as a knight without equal, sworn to the Kingsguard, friend to Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, and guardian to the realm's greatest secrets. In tournament after tournament, his prowess with Dawn turned him into a legend. In whispers, common folk said Arthur Dayne was touched by the warrior himself, that no ordinary mortal could handle that tall, gleaming sword with such fluid grace. Few knights dared face him in earnest. Fewer still walked away unbloodied. Yet for all his skill, Arthur Dayne remained a man of quiet humility, measured courtesy, and unshakable loyalty. He was not the type to revel in the gasps of the crowds. The heat of the lists was merely the means by which he honed his craft. It was on the battlefield that he served his king and his royal friend. When the winds of rebellion swept through the realm, when Robert Baratheon lifted his hammer to challenge the throne, Arthur Dayne served House Targaryen to the bitter end. But in this telling, the tapestry of fate was woven differently. Instead of perishing at the Tower of Joy, cut down by the small band of northern swords who followed Eddard Stark to rescue Lyanna, Arthur Dayne survived. The legends have many reasons why. Some said the sword Dawn, ever watchful for the realms of men, would not permit him to fall that day. Others said the gods themselves had chosen him for a task not yet complete. Perhaps it was a mixture of both, or perhaps it was simple chance. The edge of a blade glancing off a rock, the torque of a blow that missed its mark, an arrow's flight that found armor rather than flesh. Surviving the Tower of Joy did not mean stepping away unscathed. He lay gravely wounded after the clash, the red mud around him sodden with the blood of fallen friends. Ser Gerald Hightower was dead. Prince Rhaegar was dead. The Targaryen cause was in tatters, and the realm was shifting toward a new age under Robert's rule. Eddard Stark, slow to see a great and honorable knight die senselessly, gave Arthur the mercy of skilled healers, even if it was a grudging mercy. With the others who had surrendered at the tower, Ned arranged for Dayne's transport to Starfall so he might recover, or die, amidst his own kin. At Starfall, under the strict watch of his sister Aishera and the other Daynes, Arthur clung to life. For weeks, he lingered in a gray haze of delirium, never truly sure if the war's end had been a dream. Torn between fevered nightmares of Rhaegar's silver hair spattered with blood, Lyanna Stark's dying whispers, and the image of Dawn calling to him in darkness, he drifted in and out of consciousness. When at last he woke, the rebellion was long over. Robert Baratheon was king in King's Landing, Tywin Lannister had consolidated power, and the Targaryens, those who survived, had scattered across the narrow sea. Much of Westeros breathed easier, believing that the darkness of the Mad King's reign was forever ended. But Arthur Dayne's soul felt anything but light. He had sworn to protect a realm, a prophecy, and a friend. He had failed all of them. Once he could walk again, Arthur retreated to the armory where Dawn hung in its rightful place. He would stand in that dim chamber for hours, leaning on a cane to support his still healing wounds, gazing upon the sword that had defined his life. A greater destiny than any mere mortal knight, that was what had been promised to the Sword of the Morning. Or so the stories claimed. Yet Arthur felt only regret and shame, a hollow ache he could not name. He wondered if the sword had chosen wrongly, placing its faith in him. The days and weeks slid by. Under King Robert's new order, the realms seemed to settle into a period of relative calm. Ravens arrived at Starfall with official pardons for Arthur Dayne. Some said due to Ned Stark's respect and his recollection of Arthur's chivalry. Robert, who always admired a good fighter, saw no reason to carry old grudges if Arthur was not out to challenge his throne. Ashera, Lady Dayne in all but name, helped manage the daily affairs. Though rumors of her heartbreak and subsequent tragedies circulated, she always welcomed Arthur's presence with kindness. She asked him to rest, to stay in Dorne in peace, to accept the new world. But peace did not come. Through the quiet of Starfall's nights, Arthur began to feel something dark stirring beyond the horizon. He was not a sorcerer, nor a green seer, nor a practitioner of any arcane art. Yet the sword Dawn, which he tried so valiantly to keep polished and ready, seemed to reverberate in his hands with a faint disquiet whenever he lifted it to practice. As if the blade itself sensed a shift in the cosmic balance, a tremor in the heartbeat of the world. Furtive dreams plagued Arthur's sleep. He saw a cold wind sweeping down from the far north. He saw an army of pale figures, tall and silent, with eyes glowing a deep, implacable blue. He saw a great darkness covering the living, swallowing every glint of hope. And then he saw dawn flicker with white flames, though the sword itself was not consumed. A voice whispered that a sword alone could not save the living, but a blade blessed with the power of flame and forged anew might stand against the endless night. In the mornings, Arthur woke drenched in sweat, uncertain of whether the dream was a portent or the product of a mind still tormented by guilt and loss. Yet the dream returned, in multiple variations, always culminating in that image of dawn brandished against the cold. He thought it might be a personal delusion until Ashera came to him one morning with worry in her eyes. She said she heard him in the night, calling out to no one, speaking of shadows with bright blue eyes. She had stood in the corridor, fear tugging at her because something in Arthur's voice rang with profound dread. Arthur tried to dismiss it, but he could see the concern etched in his sister's features. They both knew there were tales older than the Targaryens, older than the Undulls, older even than the First Men. Tales of the Long Night, the Others, and the great hero who once wielded a blade of living fire. Much of it was considered myth, but House Dayne knew something of the more ancient histories, for the foundation of Starfall went back countless generations. One evening, after the sun dipped beneath the horizon, Arthur ventured into the crypt where the earliest Danes slept in stone. Candles flickered over effigies carved with archaic features. Dawn, or a blade resembling it, was carved into the hands of those effigies. He knelt before these statues, feeling the weight of history press on him. He spoke aloud, his voice echoing in the stillness. "Is it madness or a calling?" he asked the silent watchers. "Did you once fight the darkness too? Is that why dawn is said to be forged from the heart of a fallen star? Is it meant for more than just knighthood and tournaments?" Of course, the dead did not reply, but as he stared at one of the oldest statues, its features so worn by centuries that its face was barely recognizable, he thought he sensed an answer. Not in words, but in a hush that settled around him, and a faint vibration like a gentle hum through the stone. It passed through him swiftly, like a ghost's breath, leaving him uncertain whether he had felt anything at all, but it emboldened him nevertheless. In the coming weeks, Arthur began to train again in earnest, pushing his weakened body to regain its old strength. The pain in his side flared whenever he twisted too sharply, a scar from the Tower of Joy that would never fully vanish. Yet he refused to let that hamper him. Hour upon hour he drilled in the courtyard with wooden swords, ignoring the stares of new recruits or veterans who had once known him as the legendary Sword of the Morning. They marveled to see him so determined, even though the realm no longer demanded it. A few dared ask him what new war he prepared for. He never answered them, for he knew most would never understand. How could he explain the bleak nightmares, the sense that the cold itself was creeping slowly toward the kingdoms, unseen by men busy with their feuds and petty ambitions? There was no war to announce yet, no rumor of White Walkers surging from the lands of always winter. And so the men around him shrugged and accepted that Arthur Dayne was a knight who could not lay down his sword, even in peace. Yet the dreams persisted, growing more vivid. He saw a crowned figure atop a skeletal horse, eyes rimmed in frost and a cloak that shimmered with ice crystals. He felt a freezing wind slice through the illusions of safety that men clung to. He witnessed great battles in a swirl of snow and despair, with the living overrun by an endless tide of whites. And then, in every dream, a moment came when dawn was not enough. The sword would clash against an icy spear, or an enemy of rime and darkness would shatter steel. Arthur would stand alone, battered, on the brink of certain defeat, until a roar of fire lit the heavens. It was only upon awakening that he recalled Prince Rhaegar's talks of prophecy, that business with Azor Ahai reborn, the prince that was promised, and a flaming sword. Arthur had listened politely, but he had never delved deep into the lore. Rhaegar himself had believed he might be the prophesied hero, or else his child might fulfill the ancient predictions. Arthur had shrugged in confusion at the time. Who was he to interpret the riddles of the past? He only knew how to wield a blade, how to serve his king, how to keep his vows. But now Rhaegar was gone, and the living had grown complacent. Eventually, it was not enough for Arthur to pace the castle grounds. He took to wandering the coastline near Starfall, letting the surf crash at his feet, gazing upon the red and purple hues of dusk. He remembered a time when he was just a boy, swordless, climbing the dunes of the Torrentine's mouth. In those days, he believed House Dayne's storied origins were but romantic legends to give children a sense of wonder. Now, with each wave, he felt the pull of something older and deeper. He caught glimpses of starry patterns in the sky that he had not noticed before, constellations that seemed to shift with the season. Occasionally, he would speak with old men and women from the surrounding villages, hearing scraps of rumor and superstition, wild tales of a dark star that hovered in the sky, or ghostly apparitions seen in the mountains at night. He let these stories wash over him, searching for any hint that his dreams were not mere illusions. Nothing concrete emerged until one twilight, when an ancient fisherwoman pointed out to Arthur the bright red star that glimmered near the horizon. She claimed that for 3 nights she had seen it flare with greater intensity than any star in the heavens. She believed it to be the old star that had fallen to earth to forge dawn, awakened again as an omen. Omen of what? Arthur had asked quietly. She had only shrugged with wide eyes, fear etched in every line of her weathered face. I don't know, sir, but in my grandmother's day, they said that star burns brightest when the dawn needs to be remade. The words lingered in Arthur's ears long after she hobbled away. That night, he found himself back in the Dayne library, searching among old scrolls and fragments of myths. He was not a maester, nor was he particularly bookish, but he had enough discipline to read through the dust and archaic tongues. He found references to Dragonsteel, an elusive term often conflated with Valyrian steel, described as a metal forged in dragonfire or hammered in the heart of a fallen star. The lines were incomplete and contradictory. Some said Dragonsteel was the only steel that could truly keep the cold at bay. Others claimed it was a myth or that Valyrian steel was its descendant. But a pattern emerged. Again and again, mention of forging a sword anew or washing it in living flame, to serve as a champion's weapon against the others. Arthur realized that if the legends of the Long Night were true, then Dawn's pale blade, said to be forged from a fallen star, might be a key. Perhaps it was the seed from which a far greater steel could be born. The notion was daunting. Dawn was the pride of House Dayne, an artifact so ancient that it predated the founding of Starfall itself. To reforge it would mean risking its destruction. Could he truly consider such a course? When he tried to set the idea aside, the dreams returned with greater fervor. Dawn, though formidable, was not enough. A blade of living flame, whether literal or symbolic, was needed to stand against the creeping night, and so the notion took root, refusing to be dislodged. He broached the subject to Ashera in private, in the castle's solarium where the pink glow of sunset filtered through high windows. He explained his dreams and the glimpses he had found in House Dayne's oldest tomes. She listened quietly, her dark eyes never leaving his face. She was no stranger to sorrow herself, and for years she had moved through life with a kind of dignified sadness. But as Arthur spoke of the rising threat of forging a new blade, he saw in her expression something reminiscent of the girl she had once been. A hopeful flicker that his words, however strange, might carry truth and purpose. A darkness beyond the wall, she murmured when he finished. You think the others, those ancient demons, will rise again? He hesitated, I do not know if it is the others alone or something else, but I sense a cold tide is coming, and I feel that dawn must change to meet it. You would destroy our most sacred heirloom? She asked, a slight tremor in her voice. No, he said firmly. Not destroy, transform. If the fates have chosen House Dayne, if the star that fell millennia ago was meant to guard the realm, then perhaps forging dawn into something greater is its true destiny. And if I am the sword of the morning, it falls to me to do this, or at least to try. Ashera was silent for a long moment. At length she nodded slowly. I've seen the way you pace at night, Arthur. You've carried a burden ever since you returned from the Tower of Joy. Perhaps some would call it madness, but if there is even a small chance that your vision is correct, we cannot ignore it. It was the consent he sought, though she made it clear that most of the family might not support him if they knew. The forging of the new sword would be a secret, known only to a trusted few. For if Arthur was wrong, or if the forging went awry, it might ruin House Dayne's most precious legacy. Yet she would not stop him. She even offered to help, in whatever quiet way she could. Thus began Arthur Dayne's quest to discover the secrets of Reforging Dawn. The libraries and archives of Starfall held limited knowledge. The scribes had never intended for such a project. Dawn was revered as the final product, not a piece awaiting the smith's hammer. But Arthur gleaned a few hints. References to dragonfire, intense heat well beyond the forges of normal men, mentions of spells or incantations lost to time, and cryptic lines about forging steel with living blood. The next step was to venture beyond Dorne, disguised as a simple knight-errant. His face partially concealed beneath a hood, Arthur set out to gather knowledge from the citadel in Old Town. Though House Dayne was known in the Reach, few would recognize him as the famous Sword of the Morning if they only glimpsed a subdued traveler. Besides, war had ended and a new generation was coming of age. Faces of the rebellion's era were already drifting into memory. At Old Town, he spent countless hours speaking with novices and curators. He dug through dusty tomes on Valyrian steel, on the forging techniques of the Freehold, and on ancient accounts of heroes who stood against the Long Night. Officially, the Citadel recognized that Valyrian steel was now the pinnacle of metalwork, and the art of forging it had been mostly lost when the Doom consumed Valyria. They believed no one living could reforge the metal from scratch, though some smiths like Tobo Mott in King's Landing had the skill to rework existing Valyrian blades. But none, to Arthur's knowledge, had the knowledge of forging something akin to Dragonsteel from raw components, or from a star-forged relic like Dawn. He found only fragments, a rumor that a blacksmith in Qohor might have discovered partial secrets, a memory of a Red Priest's sermon in Volantis about flames that could purify steel, a reference to hidden texts in the vaults beneath Summerhall before it burned. Most of it was contradictory and incomplete, yet one name kept appearing: Dragonstone. It was said that during the heyday of the Targaryen rule, certain forges on Dragonstone had harnessed the volcanic flows beneath the island's bedrock to reach temperatures near to those used by Valyrian smiths. The Targaryens themselves had used the fires of their dragons for certain experimental forges. Arthur's path was clear. If he was to attempt forging Dawn anew, he would need intense heat, possibly akin to dragonfire. But the Targaryens were all but gone, and the only known dragons had perished years ago, unless one believed wild rumors of eggs hatched across the sea. As for Dragonstone, it was now the seat given to Stannis Baratheon by his brother Robert. The notion of presenting himself there, unbidden, was fraught with risks. But Arthur did not see another way. He left Old Town with heavy thoughts. He also carried a curious piece of lore, a mention that Dragonsteel might require the blood of the champion to bind fire to the metal. The words were obscure, possibly symbolic, but they resonated uncomfortably with an old story Rhaegar once told him about Azor Ahai needing to temper Lightbringer in the heart's blood of a loved one. That legend implied a terrible sacrifice. Arthur prayed it would not come to that. Returning briefly to Starfall, he conferred with Ashera. She was alarmed by the mention of blood sacrifice. Arthur tried to ease her worries, saying they did not know if that was the only method. Perhaps the blood could be offered in some smaller token, a mere drop to meld his life force with the forging. Ashera sighed and urged caution. She also admitted that the day might come when he needed help from mages or priests who understood the deeper mysteries. Before parting ways, she asked if he intended to cross the sea to search for Targaryens and dragons. He paused, unsure. The rumors placed Viserys and Daenerys Targaryen somewhere in the Free Cities. But they were in hiding, and any approach from Arthur Dayne, a famous former Kingsguard, could be seen as a threat or a trap. Besides, they were children, and if any eggs had survived, he doubted they would be hatching so soon. My best chance is to see if Dragonstone's forges can replicate the necessary heat, he finally told her. If not, I will consider seeking out mages across the narrow sea. And do you truly believe you can face this Night King Yo? You see in your dreams? Ashera asked softly, her voice laced with worry. Arthur had no certain answer. I only know that if I fail, the cost could be all of Westeros. If my dreams are not madness, then the realm is in peril. She embraced him before he departed, tears shimmering in her eyes. I pray the gods watch over you, brother. And so Arthur Dayne set out upon the road again, dawn wrapped in layers of cloth to hide its distinctive white sheen. He traveled north along the Rose Road, avoiding major cities when possible. At times, he passed blacksmith shops or watched traveling crafters plying their trade, but none had the knowledge he sought. The forging of normal steel was child's play compared to what he envisioned. As he traveled, he encountered pockets of unrest. Bandits prowled the byways, pilgrims headed to the Great September in King's Landing, merchants complaining of new taxes. These minor troubles reminded him of how fragile peace could be. He intervened when he saw injustice, but always tried to remain inconspicuous. Helping a frightened farmer fend off desperate brigands gave him small satisfaction, though it felt hollow compared to the weight of his mission. At the Trident, he briefly recalled the day Prince Rhaegar fell to Robert's hammer. The wide expanse of water glimmered under the sun, deceptively peaceful. He passed the spot with a solemn bow of his head. Then he continued east until the salt wind of Blackwater Bay rose to greet him. Soon, he found himself gazing out across the water to the dark silhouette of Dragonstone. Dragonstone had been the Targaryen seat for generations, ever since they first arrived from Valyria. Now it was held by Stannis Baratheon. Gaining entrance to the island fortress would not be simple, especially under a false identity. But as fortune would have it, Stannis was known to be in King's Landing or at Storm's End more often than not, leaving Dragonstone to a minimal garrison. If Arthur could manage to speak to the Castellan, perhaps his knowledge of forging could be bartered as a service or curiosity. He booked passage on a small merchant vessel heading to Dragonstone's harbor. The sea crossing was short but choppy. Dark clouds hung overhead, and the basalt walls of the fortress loomed like a massive dragon's back against the horizon. Smoke curled from the vents in the rocky slopes, a reminder of the volcanic energies that still churned beneath the island. Upon arriving, Arthur discovered that the keep was indeed lightly manned. A few guards in Baratheon livery wandered the dock, eyeing him suspiciously as he approached. He claimed to be a traveling blacksmith's apprentice seeking knowledge of the famed Dragonstone forges. Though they looked uncertain, they directed him to speak with the castle steward, a man named Brian Faring. Brian Faring was a cautious sort, with thin lips and a calculating gaze. He listened to Arthur's request with mild impatience. "You want to see our forges? The master of the Driftmark Forge is not here to teach every wandering craftsman." "I understand," Arthur replied, "but I've heard the forges beneath Dragonstone are the hottest in Westeros. I wish to see if they can smelt a special metal I carry." Faring lifted an eyebrow. "Special metal?" Arthur swallowed and unwrapped a portion of Dawn's cloth covering, revealing just enough of the pale surface for Brian to see its eerie sheen. The steward's eyes widened. He stepped closer, peering at the strange hue. "What metal is that?" "A star's metal," Arthur said quietly. "I have reason to believe it might require extraordinary heat to be reforged." The steward exhaled. "I have never seen steel like that. Or is it steel at all?" He scratched his chin, torn between curiosity and suspicion. At last, with a shrug, he summoned a guard. "Take him to the master smith in the lower keep." Let him show his skill. If he can pay for the materials or offer something in exchange for the use of our forge, perhaps we can come to an arrangement." Arthur bowed in thanks. As he was led deeper into the castle, he felt an odd sense of mingled dread and excitement. The fortress seemed half alive, with walls shaped into gargoyle-like dragons, hallways twisting in labyrinthine patterns. Sulphurous steam rose from vents in the floor of the lower levels, and the heat clung to every surface. Far below, there were said to be vents that led directly to pockets of magma. He found the master smith in a broad, low-ceilinged chamber lit by glowing coals. The man was old, bald, and stooped, yet his arms bulged with muscle. He eyed Arthur's blade with a silent awe. "That's no common steel," he muttered. "Looks near white as milk glass." Arthur nodded. "I need your help. I believe if we can generate enough heat, we can rework it into a new form." The old smith frowned. "A blade's a blade, lad. If it's good steel, why break it? This is a thing of beauty." "I believe it needs to be something more," Arthur said, choosing his words carefully. "If we can fold in additional metals, silver, black iron, perhaps trace amounts of Valyrian steel if you have them, and quench it with certain methods, I hope we can improve it." The smith gave him a sideways look. "You talk like a maester or a madman." "Perhaps both," Arthur said, forcing a slight smile. "Will you try?" The old man shrugged. "If you can pay for the materials, I'll do the work. But I make no promises. If I ruin this fancy blade, it won't be my fault." Arthur agreed, and so began a series of experiments. Over the course of days, they heated dawn in the roaring fires of Dragonstone's forges. The metal glowed a brilliant white, almost painful to look upon. The smith hammered it, folded it with layers of steel he had on hand, then quenched it in oil. Each time they tested the blade's hardness. But the metal resisted fusion with normal steels. The whitish core refused to bond properly, as if it possessed a will of its own. Arthur assisted as best he could, though he lacked the smith's lifetime of practical experience. Yet he felt intimately tied to the blade. He could sense its reluctance, almost as if Dawn were resisting the transformation. After a week, the old smith wiped sweat from his brow and scowled. "Whatever you've got here won't mix with normal metals. You need something else, something as rare as your star metal." When Arthur tentatively asked if there was any Valyrian steel or dragonglass available, the smith spat. "Dragonglass, yes, plenty of that. It's not steel, though, and it's too brittle. Valyrian steel, maybe a fragment or two from older weapons left behind, but not enough to do anything meaningful. And I can't properly melt Valyrian steel either, only reshape it some." Arthur considered the mention of dragonglass. It was said that the others could be harmed by dragonglass daggers. Could that property help if combined with Dawn's star metal? But the problem was dragonglass was volcanic glass, not a metal, and forging it together with steel seemed impossible. He recalled the old references to dragonfire being essential. This forge was hot, but no living dragon breathed flame here. Perhaps that was the missing link. Without actual dragonfire, it was hopeless. Days turned into weeks. Arthur's funds dwindled, and the old smith grew weary of repeated failures. Finally, after yet another unsuccessful attempt, the smith shook his head. "I'm sorry, lad. This blade is unlike anything I've seen, but I can't change its nature. If you want it melted to slag, maybe I can do that, but forging it to a new shape? I doubt it." Arthur stared at the half-warped shape of Dawn, its once pristine lines battered from repeated heating and hammering. He felt shame burning in his chest. Had he defiled his house's sacred sword for nothing? If the forging were truly meant to be, would the gods not have provided the means? A few nights later, as he sat alone in a cramped chamber near the forge, nursing an ale, he found himself praying quietly to the Seven, and even to the old gods he had never known. He prayed for a sign, for direction. He prayed that Rhaegar's talk of destiny was not an empty dream, that House Dayne's purpose was not lost. On the cusp of sleep, he had the clearest vision yet. In it, he walked through a corridor of darkness, dragging Dawn's battered shape behind him. At the end of the corridor, a single door blazed with light. When he passed through, he stood atop a wall of ice so high it pierced the heavens. The wind howled, carrying the shrieks of the dead. From the gloom, a figure emerged. A king with eyes of frosted blue, crowned in ice. The king of the others, or the Night King, raised a sword formed of swirling cold. Arthur, heart hammering in his chest, lifted Dawn. But it would not shine. The blade was dull, gray, lifeless. In that moment, he knew he was beaten. A single blow from the ice sword shattered Dawn into 1,000 shards. But as those shards flew outward, each fragment burst into flame. The flames consumed the swirling snow, driving back the darkness. Arthur collapsed to his knees, watching in shock as the flames coalesced into a single blade, floating before him. Its surface flickered with a fiery aura, as if the star metal had awakened. Then he realized his hands were covered in blood, his own blood, and the blade drank it in. He woke gasping, the taste of ash on his tongue. That final image burned in his mind. To reforge Dawn, he might have to break it entirely, and blood would be required. His blood. Dread weighed heavily on him. Was he truly prepared to make such a sacrifice? Would it mean his death or some other price? He resolved to try. If the realm was truly at stake, his life was a small price. The next day, he gathered what meager supplies he had left and prepared to leave Dragonstone. Before he did, he went to the old smith one last time. He handed the man a small pouch of coins. "I need a crucible," Arthur said, "and a place where I can do this alone. You owe me nothing else." "I thank you for your efforts." The smith scowled but took the coins. "You're a stubborn fool. I hope you know that." Arthur only nodded. Once he had acquired a heavy crucible capable of withstanding extreme heat, along with an old anvil and a hammer, he descended deeper into the volcanic vents under the fortress. He waited until nightfall, then snuck past the lower guards, forging deeper into the labyrinthine tunnels that rumbled with the heat of the earth. There, he found a small chamber where the rock glowed red and molten. Dragonstone had many such places, though few dared to linger there. He set the crucible in a niche where the magma's heat licked at the metal. Carefully, he placed the battered remnants of Dawn inside. As the sword began to glow, he drew a short dagger and took a steadying breath. If he was wrong, he might die here, and Dawn would be destroyed forever. But every fiber of his being screamed that this was the moment. The dreams demanded it. He slid the blade across his palm, grimacing as pain flared. Blood welled from the gash, dripping darkly in the flickering glow. Without hesitation, he held his hand over the crucible, letting his blood fall upon the star metal. Dawn hissed as the droplets touched it, an eerie sound like steel crying out. Arthur tightened his jaw and continued until his hand trembled, until enough of his lifeblood had mingled with the heating blade. Then he gripped the hammer in his uninjured hand, teeth clenched against the pain. He watched the steel glow and begin to melt, a sight that tore at him, for this was the legendary blade of his house. He pounded the metal in the crucible as best he could, though it was a crude, dangerous process. The crucible itself threatened to crack. Sparks flew, scorching his arms and face. Each strike sent pain lancing through his wounded hand, and the hot air seared his lungs. The star metal liquefied, swirling with the darker streaks of the steel folded earlier and the crimson swirl of Arthur's blood. In that swirl, he sensed something deep and primordial. He hammered again and again, chanting a silent prayer. His mind drifted to Rhaegar, to Ash-Era, to all he had lost, and to the nameless countless souls who might be lost if the long night returned. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The heat battered him like a living force, and blood loss made him dizzy. Yet he kept hammering, shaping the molten mixture as it started to coalesce again. Slowly, it took form, an elongated shape reminiscent of a sword's blade, though still more molten than solid. Something in the chamber shifted then, a windless gust that felt like the exhalation of a great beast. Arthur froze, sweat and blood dripping from his brow. The swirling metal flared in a sudden burst of brilliance, almost blinding. A wave of heat knocked him backward, and he fell to the rocky ground, scraping his arms. When he managed to rise, blinking away white spots from his vision. He saw that the sword shape had solidified. Pale as milk glass, yet streaked with faint threads of silver, the metal looked almost alive. The edges glowed with a subtle shimmer, as if capturing the reflection of flames that were not physically there. Arthur's injured hand throbbed, and blood still oozed from between his fingers. He moved closer to the blade, trembling. With a pair of tongs, he gingerly lifted it from the crucible. It was still radiating warmth, but not unbearably so. He placed it on the anvil and tested the metal. The blade was flexible yet strong, the edges keener than any steel he had ever known. And when he concentrated, he could feel a faint hum, as if it resonated with his heartbeat. He had no hilt prepared. In truth, he had intended to shape the sword in multiple stages, fitting a crossguard, pommel, and grip. But the forging had culminated in this sudden, explosive moment. The metal had taken shape in a near-finished form, lacking only the finer details of a standard sword's furniture. Dumbfounded, Arthur wondered if some magic had guided it. Exhausted, he staggered out of the chamber, half carrying, half dragging the new blade. The tunnel swam before his eyes, but he made it to a corridor with cooler air. His palms still bled, and the rest of his body felt battered, but he laughed in ragged relief. He sensed that Dawn, no, not Dawn anymore, but something else, was alive in his hands. That night, he collapsed in a hidden alcove, cradling the new sword, delirious with fever from his wound. He dreamed again of the icy corridor, the looming figure of the Night King. But this time, when he lifted the blade, it blazed with white flame, scattering the shadows. The Night King recoiled, and Arthur felt hope surge through him. By the time he recovered enough to leave Dragonstone, he had crafted a makeshift hilt using leather wrappings and a simple crossguard hammered from leftover steel. It was not elegant, but it would serve until he could commission a proper hilt. Before he slipped away, he tested the blade on a chunk of common steel. With a single slash, it cut cleanly, leaving the steel edges parted as if sliced by a razor. A subtle flicker of light ran along the length of the sword, confirming its uncanny properties. He departed in secrecy, lest rumors spread too soon. The sword's new name whispered in his mind, though he was not sure if he should speak it aloud. Dawn Reforged, or perhaps Dragonsteel or Lightbringer. He recalled the old tales of Azor Ahai's sword bearing that name. Yet he was no Azor Ahai, no prince. He was but a knight, the sword of the morning, reborn into a new purpose. Traveling north, Arthur felt a strange lightness in his heart. Though he knew a grave threat was on the horizon, he now had a weapon that might stand against it. That knowledge gave him resolve. The wound in his palm had scabbed over into a vicious scar, and at times it ached fiercely, but he bore it stoically. He thought of it as the bond between himself and the blade, sealed in blood. He skirted King's Landing, hearing rumors that Robert Baratheon feasted with his allies, that Eddard Stark had returned to Winterfell, that the small council bickered as always. None of that concerned him now. His path lay beyond the Neck, in the cold lands where Ned Stark held dominion. The nightmares told him that only in the far north would he find confirmation of the impending darkness. Winterfell greeted him with swirling gusts of chill wind. Winter was not fully upon the realm, but the air here bit more sharply than in the south. Arthur marveled at the castle's granite walls and steaming hot springs, recalling the last time he had come anywhere near here, during a war, chasing ghosts of prophecy. Now, he came with a mission of peace and warning. He was unsure how Ned Stark would receive him. After all, the Tower of Joy had pitted them against each other in deadly combat. Though Ned had shown mercy by sending him home to Starfall, it was still an uneasy memory. But from all accounts, Ned Stark was a man of honor. Arthur approached the gate, fully armed but with his hood drawn back so they could see his face. The guards stiffened at the sight of the pale sword on his back, though they could not have known the full story. When he requested an audience with Lord Eddard Stark, one guard vanished into the courtyard while the other eyed Arthur warily. In time, Ned Stark himself appeared, flanked by a few watchful guards. The Lord of Winterfell looked older than Arthur remembered, more solemn, as though the burdens of lordship weighed heavily on him. A hint of surprise flickered in his gray eyes upon recognizing the man before him. "Sir Arthur Dayne," Ned said gravely. "I had heard you survived, but I never thought to see you here. What brings you north?" Arthur inclined his head. "My lord, I come with tidings and warnings, though you may think me mad. May we speak in private?" Ned studied him in silence, then nodded curtly. He led Arthur into the great hall, dismissing most of the guards save for a handful. At the high table, with a crackling fire warming the hall, Arthur explained as best he could. He spoke of his dreams, the sense of a rising darkness, the forging of a new blade from dawn, and the possibility that the others might return. Ned listened impassively, his strong features betraying little, though now and then a flicker of incredulity passed over his face. "You believe the legends of the Long Night?" Ned asked quietly when Arthur finished. "I do," Arthur replied. "I believe they were never just stories for the children. My lord, I swear on my honor that I have seen glimpses, if not the others themselves, then portents of them. Their threat is real, and we are not prepared." Ned folded his hands. "You speak of forging a new blade. Let me see it." Arthur obeyed, carefully drawing the pale sword and holding it out. Ned and the guards leaned closer, eyes narrowed at the gleaming surface. In the torchlight, the metal pulsed with an inner radiance, as though capturing every reflection and bending it into a faint glow. Ned frowned and reached out to touch the flat of the blade. He drew back sharply. "It's warm," he murmured. Arthur nodded. "It holds an uncanny heat, not so hot as to burn me, but enough that I feel it. I have tested it, and it cuts steel like cloth." One of the guards, a burly man with a bushy beard, scoffed. "Tall tales, if you ask me. Looks too fancy to be real." Arthur wordlessly took a spare sword from the table. It was dull but serviceable. In a swift motion, he pressed his new blade against it and sliced. The dull sword parted with a shriek of metal, the top half clanging to the floor. Gasps echoed in the hall. Ned let out a slow breath. "This is no ordinary sword." "No," Arthur agreed. "And yet, I fear even it may not be enough if the realm does not unite against what comes." A heavy silence followed. Ned Stark stared into the fire for what felt like a small eternity. Finally, he spoke in a low voice. "I remember the tower where we fought. I remember how convinced your prince was of some prophecy. I thought it madness then. Perhaps I still do. But your presence here, and this sword, I cannot ignore it." He rose, turning to the guard. "Bring food and drink. Sir Arthur is our guest." Then he faced Arthur again. "You believe we must look beyond the wall, beyond the wildlings and the petty threats, to the far north." Arthur inclined his head. "If we are to find proof that the others are stirring, yes. I suspect it lies beyond the wall, or perhaps even in the haunted forests near it. And if they are truly on the rise, we must prepare all of Westeros." Ned's gaze hardened. "Robert will not be eager to hear such tidings. He is a warrior, yes, but he also trusts in what he can see. And the others? He would call them children's tales. Even so, I will do what I can. We Starks remember the old warnings." Arthur relaxed slightly. He had worried Ned Stark might dismiss him outright. But if anything, the Northman's calm acceptance underscored the gravity of the situation. In the days that followed, Arthur stayed at Winterfell as Ned quietly consulted with some of his bannermen. Rumors spread among the castle folk about the mysterious knight with the pale sword, but Ned kept a tight lid on the truth, not wanting to sow panic. When Ned asked if Arthur would travel to the wall, Arthur agreed immediately. The Watch might have word of strange occurrences beyond the Frostfangs or in the Shivering Sea. Ned arranged for a small party to accompany him, both as a gesture of good faith and to keep an eye on him. Sir Roderick Castle, the Master-at-Arms, volunteered to escort Arthur, along with a handful of men. They set out in the crisp air, the King's Road winding northward through bleak terrain. Each day grew colder, the nights longer. The talk around the campfire was subdued. Arthur practiced with his blade each morning and evening, though the men watched with uneasy fascination. None dared spar with him using that new sword, for fear it would slice through their armor. As they neared the wall, its vast expanse loomed like a colossal barrier of bluish ice, stretching as far as the eye could see. Arthur had heard tales of it, but seeing it in person was a different matter. He felt dwarfed by its immensity. The Night's Watch, black-clad and solemn, admitted them through the gates of Castle Black. Lord Commander Jeor Mormont greeted them with the courtesy due to envoys from Winterfell. Over a meal in the drafty hall, Arthur recounted his dreams and his forging of dawn anew. Mormont's grizzled face betrayed skepticism. "We've had no confirmed sightings of others in living memory. Wildlings, yes. Giants, sometimes. But others?" He shook his head. Arthur noticed how some of the younger Black brothers cast glances at him as though he were mad. But one old ranger, bent with age, quietly nodded. "There have been signs," the ranger muttered. "Animals found frozen, wildlings telling stories of dead men walking. We thought it might just be fear-mongering. But maybe there's more to it." Mormont seemed troubled. "The watch is stretched thin. We can barely keep an eye on the wildling raiders. If the others are real and stirring..." He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. In the end, he granted Arthur and Ser Roderick permission to travel beyond the wall with a small patrol, to see if they could find any trace of this ancient threat. Arthur's heart pounded with a mixture of excitement and dread. If there were signs, he would see them. If not, perhaps his dreams truly were madness. They rode out through the icy tunnel beneath the wall, emerging into a world of frost and shadow. The haunted forest stretched before them, gnarled trees whose branches resembled clawed hands. Snow crunched underfoot, and breath plumed in the frigid air. The watch's patrol included a scarred ranger named Corin, reputed to know the wild lands better than most. He led them along trails known to the Black brothers, searching for any camps or signs of movement. Days passed, and the cold gnawed at them relentlessly. They found abandoned wildling huts, tracks leading deeper into the mountains. Corin observed that some tracks looked older, some newer. Occasionally, they came across chilling sights. A circle of dead animals, their bodies arranged in strange patterns, as if by some unnatural hand. The men muttered of the White Walkers. Arthur's nightmares felt closer than ever. One night, while they camped in a clearing, Arthur stood guard beneath a moonless sky. The wind whispered through the trees, bringing with it a faint sound that chilled him to the bone, a distant scraping like ice on stone. He tensed, hand on his sword's hilt. He waited, but the sound did not return. Morning brought only silence. They continued north, following a rumor of a wildling tribe who claimed to have fled an encounter with the White Shadows. On the 7th day, they found fresh footprints leading toward a ravine. Corin motioned for silence, and they dismounted, proceeding on foot. Arthur's senses prickled, and he drew the reforged dawn. Its pale surface caught the weak sunlight, glimmering in the gloom. In the ravine, they discovered the remnants of a wildling camp. Broken spears, scattered furs, and spattered blood. No bodies, just eerie emptiness. Arthur knelt and touched the blood, finding it frozen solid. Crouching near the remains of a small campfire, he noticed the firewood was coated with a thin layer of frost despite being burnt. It was as though a sudden wave of freezing air had smothered the flame. No one spoke. The men fanned out cautiously, searching for any survivors or clues. Arthur's heart pounded. Every fiber of his being screamed that something unnatural had happened here. He saw footprints leading away, deeper into the ravine, footprints that seemed half human, half something else. One of the rangers hissed under his breath, pointing to the bizarre shape. They followed the prints around a bend, where the ravine widened. A hush fell over them, and Arthur's breath caught in his throat. For there, partially hidden behind a ledge, stood a figure. Tall, thin, wrapped in faint mist, its skin glimmered pale as ice. Its eyes burned blue, brighter than any sapphire, colder than any winter. An other, a White Walker. Whatever name the old stories gave it, the creature was undeniably inhuman. It regarded them with a calm, eerie intelligence, as though it had been waiting for them. Arthur felt a surge of fear, but also a peculiar resolve. He stepped forward, raising his pale sword. The creature took a step in response, unsheathing a blade that looked as though it was forged from ice itself, swirling with faint wisps of vapor. All the warnings told Arthur that no ordinary steel could stand against the others. But his sword was no ordinary steel. Taking a breath, he advanced, heart pounding like a war drum. The creature moved with unnerving grace, bringing its ice blade down in a shimmering arc. Arthur parried, bracing for the snap of his steel. Yet instead of shattering, his reforged sword clashed with the ice blade, sending a burst of white sparks into the air. An unearthly screech echoed, and the other staggered back as though surprised. Arthur seized the moment, pressing his attack. Each strike rang with that strange resonance, as if both blades fought not just physically but on a level of elemental power. His blood thrummed with energy, and the sword felt almost alive in his grip. A faint glow clung to its edges, as if remembering the forging fire. Corin and the other rangers scattered, their weapons at the ready, but they knew they were outmatched in such a supernatural duel. Arthur alone had the blade that might matter. The other hissed, stepping fluidly aside, lashing out with impossible speed. Arthur barely brought his blade up in time, and the impact numbed his arms. The cold radiating from the creature drained his strength, as if each second near it sapped the warmth from his veins. Still, he forced himself to keep moving, driving the other away from the Watchers, isolating it in open ground where he could maneuver. With a fierce cry, he lunged. The pale sword's tip slashed across the other's torso. For an instant, Arthur feared it would be like cutting into solid ice that might simply seal itself. But the blade slid through, and the creature let out a shriek that reverberated off the ravine walls. A crack formed where the blade had cut, spiderwebbing across the other's form. In a burst of icy shards, the creature fractured, collapsing into a swirling mist of frost. Panting, Arthur lowered his blade. Small shards of ice clattered to the ground, evaporating into nothing. The Watchers stared in amazement, some crossing themselves or muttering prayers. "I've never seen anything like that," one ranger breathed. "Even the tales said fire or dragonglass was needed to kill them. But your sword, gods be good." Arthur swallowed thickly, adrenaline still coursing through him. "It appears we have our proof," he said, voice trembling. Corin nodded grimly. "Proof enough. The others are real." They stood in stunned silence for a moment, the wind howling through the ravine. Their hearts pounded in unison, for they knew that if one White Walker was roaming this far south, more would follow. Arthur closed his eyes briefly, silently giving thanks for the reforged sword, and offering a prayer that all the realm would heed this warning before it was too late. When they returned to Castle Black, they bore news that would forever change the course of Westeros. The men of the Night's Watch, once uncertain, now rallied to the truth. Lord Commander Mormont realized that the ancient enemy was no myth. Birds were sent south, carrying urgent messages to Winterfell, to King's Landing, and to every major lord across the Seven Kingdoms. The gist of those letters was clear. The threat is real, and only a united realm can stand against it. Thus began a new chapter in the annals of Westeros, where the question was no longer if the darkness would come, but when. Arthur Dayne stood at the center of it, the legendary sword of the morning reborn as a champion of the living. With Dragonsteel or Lightbringer or whatever name the bards would one day call it, he had proven that the others could be slain. But the specter of the Night King loomed still larger in his dreams, a force behind the White Walkers more ancient, more cunning, and more potent. Word spread of Arthur's deed, carried by whispered rumors and excited chatter among the Black brothers. Some believed he was the prince that was promised, others that he was simply a knight favored by fate. Arthur himself claimed no grand title. He only knew that if one White Walker had nearly bested him, the Night King's power would be far greater. The forging of Dragonsteel was but the first step in a conflict that promised to eclipse all the wars of men. Before long, Ned Stark arrived at the wall in response to the Watch's summons. With him came several northern lords, all grave and solemn when they learned the truth. Standing atop the wall, Staring out at the endless forest of white, Ned turned to Arthur. "What you have done, Sir Arthur Dayne, may have saved us all from denying the truth until it was too late. We must rally the entire realm, or face the end of all we know." Arthur nodded. "I will ride to speak with King Robert, if you wish. He may not trust the Watch's warnings alone, but perhaps he will trust a knight he once fought against. I pray he remembers what it means to stand against a true enemy." Ned let out a quiet breath. "Robert is stubborn, but this goes beyond him. We'll need the Lords Tyrell, Lannister, Martell, Arryn, Greyjoy, Tully, all of them. A single sword can't save the world, no matter how powerful." Arthur's gaze drifted to the horizon. "Yet I will do my part. That is all I can promise." So began the gathering of forces, a slow and difficult process as ravens flew and lords weighed the truth of these unbelievable tidings. Some refused to believe, dismissing it as a ploy or an exaggeration by the Night's Watch to gain more men and resources. Others, recalling old stories and trusting in Ned Stark's honor, recognized the peril. Factions formed, lines were drawn, and across the narrow sea, other events stirred that might bring dragons into the fray. But for now, as the first snows of a harsh winter began to drift across the north, Arthur Dayne prepared for the next challenge. In his dreams, the Night King called to him, beckoning from the heart of the frozen wastes. Arthur awoke each morning with a cold sweat, gripping the new sword that sometimes flickered with that inner glow. With every passing day, men whispered that a champion had arisen who carried a blade of starlight against the coming darkness. Children heard the name Arthur Dayne and repeated it in awe. Bards spun songs of a once-dead knight who returned from the brink to forge a new dawn. Yet in all the praise and speculation, Arthur himself remained humble, for he knew that forging the blade was only the beginning. The time would come when the Night King himself would step forward. If the realm did not unite, if the living failed to set aside their feuds, then even the mightiest sword might fail. And so, from the battlements of Castle Black, Arthur Dayne watched the swirling snows to the north, resolved in his heart that he would do whatever it took, endure any wound, make any sacrifice, to drive back the night that threatened to consume them all. For beyond the wall, in the silent wastes, the Night King was stirring. Whispers of an ancient power coursed through the wind and snow, a force older than the first men, older than the children of the forest, older perhaps than memory itself. An echo of the earliest battles that once brought the long night. It felt the forging of a weapon that could rival its own icy blade, and it did not fear. It had seen mortals try before, and it had watched them fall. But this time, the champion was Arthur Dayne, who bore not just steel but the will of generations past, the blood of his own sacrifice, and the faint memory of a prophecy unfulfilled. Where men might falter, the sword would blaze, for it was born of the stars and tempered by the fires of a knight's resolve. And so the stage was set for a contest that would determine the fate of Westeros. Far from the petty squabbles of the Iron Throne, a greater struggle brewed in the frigid north, a struggle between the unyielding cold of death and the stubborn spark of life, carried by a single blade that shone like the first hint of dawn on a winter horizon. In that twilight between hope and despair, Arthur Dayne stood as a silent sentinel, sword in hand, prepared to face the Night King when the hour of doom arrived. And though he did not know if he would triumph or merely buy the realm a moment's respite, he vowed that he would hold the line until the last spark of his life flickered out. For he was the sword of the morning, and now he was the guardian of the new dawn.